All right, our goal today is to understand the basics of annotation, what it is, how it benefits you as a reader and as a learner, and then how to do it. So on the right, you see kind of an example of an annotated text. You'll see this student has, or reader has clearly analyzed the text, thought about it a lot, added their own notes. And that's just going to benefit everything they do with this text from that point on. So what is annotation? It's just the process of marking up a text for further analysis or close reading, or both. Many of you have annotated before and you've told me that. So this might be review, but this might also have a few new steps that you might not be familiar with. And I'm going to teach 5 different steps that we use flexibly in this course and then also in other English courses on our campus too. So why annotate? Another purpose is to prepare to respond in discussion or in writing, or both. When you have like a prompt that you know you're going to be responding to on a text, you're going to want to annotate and mark up evidence that you could use to respond to that text. So that's another purpose that we could be thinking about. So one thing that you might be asked to do when annotating is to define unfamiliar words. So this is like the vocab step. It's a lot like the game we played yesterday in class, if you were here on the 14th. Yesterday was Wednesday, where we looked for context clues for an unfamiliar word and then made our best guess, or you can look up the word and then define it in the actual text. If you're annotating on paper, you're just going to circle it and jot it down. If you're annotating digitally, it's kind of nice because you're able to look up the word right there in front of you, just on the Google Docs tools. Let me show you guys that real quick. It's kind of a cool tool if you haven't discovered it yet. Let's see. We'll go into an article from last year. Okay. This was an article a student submitted last year with annotations. Let's say that you are wanting to define this word right here. There's a tool to do that on the right. Oh, let me do that one more time. Define. There we go. And it'll show you right in the text. So that's kind of the vocab step. You won't be asked to do that very often, but it's a nice way to kind of trace unfamiliar words and concepts that you will need to understand to get more out of the text. A lot of times we read and we just bleep over words we don't know, and that's actually a good reading skill, right? You're not letting yourself get tripped up in content that you don't understand. But some of you have really complex articles about psychology, about sociology, about economics, and you want to make sure that you understand the basic concepts and the basic terms of that subject. Otherwise, you're not going to get much out of your article. So if you have one of those meatier texts on a subject that you're unfamiliar with, make sure that you pay particular attention to this step because that's going to help you a lot. Alrighty. Similarly, one more thing on vocab. If you know all of the terms, you can also, this can be a helpful step, you can also circle words that are central to the message of the text or to the main idea of the text, which is going to help you start seeing patterns that you're noticing and things that the author is emphasizing. So even vocab can help you get to a central message of a text and to get more close reading out of whatever you're reading. By the way, these are steps you can use for absolutely anything. So it could be anything from a written advertisement to an article to a poem. This is not genre specific. These are all skills that will help you get more out of your reading and will also help sharpen your reading and writing skills. So don't think that it's just this one context of annotating an article. There are a lot of different ways to use these skills. Step 2 is content. So content, and I should have put this on my slides here, content is the what of a text. So it relates pretty closely to vocab in the sense that vocab also is going to point to kind of our content or our main concepts of a text. But the content is the what. So if you're asked to annotate for content, you might be asked to provide short summaries of each paragraph or each chunk. And if you're not sure about that word chunk, I'll explain that for step 3. But if you're ever asked to summarize for content, it does not mean that you're commenting on the text. It means that you're just going to summarize so that in the end, This is just a brief example on the right, but in the end, you have statements that help chunk and summarize what the content of the article is. So you're basically taking it from a maybe 3-page article down to a couple sentences of summary on the right. Your annotation should be so strong that you could read those summaries and I ask that you annotate if you're annotating for content, do it on the right. But your annotation should be so strong that you could read those content summaries off to someone else, and they're still going to have a good idea of what your article was about without even reading the whole thing. And then here's a little note on summarizing. Summarizing just teaches us to highlight relevant information and to ignore irrelevant information. Teaching students to summarize improves memory for what is read. So that can really help too if you're annotating for something that you're going to have to come back to in a class or remember for a quiz. Those summary statements can really help. So annotating for content is the what. And if annotating for content is the what, annotating for structure is kind of like the how. So how did this author chunk or structure the article in order to achieve their purpose, in order to share their content? So structure, again, is the how. Let me add that to that slide. That should be there. Notice how I'm revising as I go, because revision is, oh, no, it's not the why, it's the how. Revision is key to success in pretty much any piece of writing or product or presentation. Okay, so structure is the how. So this is where you're going to chunk the article into sections. So on the right, you'll see this little graphic. You might be drawing boxes around where you see the different sections of your text. A lot like if we were to take Most Dangerous Game and chunk it into exposition, inciting incident, rising action, maybe a transition into another piece of rising action, maybe a transition to another piece of rising action, climax, and so forth. You're going to do the same thing with your text, even if it's nonfiction instead of fiction. Hopefully you feel like if we were to take Most Dangerous Game and chunk it, we could do that. We kind of did that activity on the board when you guys use sticky notes to map out the structure of the text. Very similar here. So here you're going to draw lines between the major sections of text, intro, body, conclusion, and use the terms on this slide. You might want to either take a screenshot or jot them down somewhere. You'll also have access to the slide so you can come back to this. But this is where you're going to draw lines between or put boxes around the major sections of text to map out the pattern and the structure. If you're wondering why this is important, this is actually a really good way to sharpen not only your reading skills, because you're going to start to notice predictable patterns and become a more effective predictor and a reader, but this is a really good way to sharpen your writing skills, because you're going to start to see some really effective patterns that authors use to prove a point or to share information or to entertain. You're going to draw a line after the intro and at the start of the conclusion, chunk the major sections. So if you see an obvious transition, for example, the phrase "on the other hand" or "in addition to this" could be transition phrases. And in the left-hand margin, if you're annotating for structure, go ahead and label and, like I said, put lines through to separate the major sections of text. You're usually going to see an introduction. You might see a whole paragraph of claims or maybe a standalone sentence of a claim. You might see a thesis. You might see body, evidence, or issue. You might see a call to action. And if you see any other devices, like, for example, a transition paragraph or an anecdote, like a short story paragraph, something like that, that's kind of what you're going to do. Guys, this is a super imperfect process. So when you sit down with your article and you're practicing this, just give it some practice and we'll go over feedback in class. See if you can start to map out the structure using these terms highlighted. Just give it a go and we'll get more into this later because this can be a little bit of a tough skill. Before I move on, one thing to note, if you have a really long text, you are welcome to pick only what you need to annotate. For this specific assignment, I'm going to ask that you do all steps, but that's not always going to be the case. But for this specific text, while we get going on these skills, I'd like you to use all of the steps that I'm teaching in this video. So if you have like a 7-page article, maybe annotate the first 3 pages or the first 2 pages on the last page. Oftentimes, when you look at just the introduction and the conclusion of a text, you're going to be able to get a good roundabout idea of the author's message or the author's content and purpose, even without reading the middle sometimes. So pay close attention to the intro and the conclusion of your text. And again, if you have a really long article, feel free to annotate just the sections that you know are going to teach you more about your research question and your topic. All right, let's talk about purpose. If content is the what and the structure is the how, then the purpose is the why behind a text. And for purpose, if a teacher is asking you to annotate for purpose, they're looking for what is the author's intent. They're looking for how you are tracking the author's intent of each chunk. So you can look at the chunks that you've annotated and think about, okay, well, what is the purpose of this chunk? For example, if we're looking at Most Dangerous Game, the purpose of the exposition is to introduce the setting and the characters. Similarly, if you're looking at an article on poverty, you might chunk the introduction as the first 3 paragraphs and write a purpose statement for the first 3 paragraphs that says introduces the topic with examples and statistics. So you're annotating for the author's intent behind each chunk. Some students do this each paragraph. It doesn't matter. You can do either one, but I always find it easier to annotate each chunk because you've already sectioned it out for what fits together. So if you know that there's like a 3-paragraph story or anecdote by the author, then you can that's all one purpose usually. So you can think about that as kind of one chunk. But this is also kind of a tricky step. So give it your best shot, but it's to describe the purpose of each chunk with a verb phrase. So you're thinking about the author's intent, not yours, not the writer's intent, or I'm sorry, not the reader's intent. You're thinking about what the author was doing in each chunk. To do this, you might also want to think about the purpose of the entire text in general, but focus specifically on each chunk too. Again, this is going to help you see really effective patterns in writing. Here's an example, introduces the topic with a simple story. So if you're reading an article and you notice the first maybe whole page is all a short, simple story by the author to introduce the topic of, let's say, loneliness or isolation, that might be your purpose statement for that chunk. Maybe you're reading a argumentative text and you notice that the author switches to arguments on the other side, kind of like they share their own arguments about a topic and then they share the other sides. Your purpose statement might be something like provides and refutes evidence from the other side of the argument. So you're really highlighting what was the author's intent behind this section. This can be a really hard way to think, so give yourself some patience as you try to work on this skill. It will pay off because to get into an author's head has a lot of benefits as a reader and a writer. And on the right, we have author's purpose, reason, and why they write. Please feel free to use these verbs when you're thinking about purpose or annotating for purpose. I find those pretty helpful. And then lastly, you might be asked to respond to a text. This is the most fun because it's usually the most simple. This is where you're just after you've closely read that text and you feel confident with the content, you know the purpose behind the text in each chunk, you know the structure the author used, then you're just going to respond because you have engaged in a conversation, you've listened to the author, and now it's time for you to respond to the author. You know what they've said, you've quote unquote listened to them carefully, kind of like you would in a conversation. So now you're going to enter that conversation with your own thoughts, notes, questions, arguments, etc. There's some examples on the right side of the screen. So feel free to agree or disagree at this point. Kind of hard to do that if your article is just an informational text, right? If there's not really an argument. Or you could just join the conversation with your own thoughts, questions, evidence, or counterclaims. If you're really an argumentative person, if you like debate, maybe go through and annotate for things you disagree with and counter some evidence and some claims in the text. That can be a really good way to take a closer look at a text. You can also, if you want to use kind of the punctuation tools, I like to use exclamation point, like if something surprises me, question mark if I know I need to come back to something, if it's confusing or if it doesn't make sense, or if I just want to discuss it with a partner. And then a little star for maybe important quotes throughout the text, especially if you know you're going to have some sort of writing task afterwards. That can be a really good way to mark those sections and then come back to them to grab your evidence for like a timed write or something. All right, so I know that was a lot, so let's recap. Again, any effort you can make to practicing these skills is going to be great. So just make an effort. Maybe go back through this video and the slides if you need to when you annotate. Do we always use all these steps? No. There are different purposes for each. For example, in the sophomore and junior year curriculum, they go through some pretty tough historical documents in their courses. So they annotate for a lot of content and vocab. But in our course, we might annotate something like a short story where the only step we use might be annotating for structure, right? If we're looking for the plot map of the story or the way that the author outlined the plot. Or we might only annotate for purpose if we're writing a paragraph on the author's purpose. So those are kind of steps we can use and mix and match. For this assignment, again, please perform all 5 steps with your best effort. And we'll review these in class when we get a chance to. So make sure you bring your annotated article back. You can use color coding. If you're online, please use the commenting feature. You might also want to color code instead of draw lines through the text if you want to, like maybe the intro's in yellow and then every other section switches colors. Up to you. But if you are annotating digitally, you might have to just get a little creative about how you do that. So utilize the commenting feature, if you will, to complete that. And then there's a little note on the power of annotating on the right, which you can read. Again, it really, really helps us focus on what we're reading, understanding details, keeping closer track of your thoughts, keeps track of important details, helps you prepare for discussion and writing. So there's a lot of benefits. And once you get going, and once we work with these skills more, I know you'll start to see those benefits pay off. And then I get to see it pay off in your writing and in your discussions. So have at it. Comment with any questions. And we'll go over your data the next time we meet in class. All right. Thank you.